Are you a fan of turn-based combat? Have you conquered the likes of the Firaxis XCOM games and Darkest Dungeon? Or maybe you kicked butt in Battle Brothers. And now you've heard about Xenonauts 2 and you're wondering whether it can offer a real challenge after you've honed your skills in such difficult games? Well, my friend, you should prepare yourself for a confrontation that might look a little bit like this. Hi, this is Tapcat, and today I'm going to give you a look at Xenonauts 2 from Goldhawk Interactive. This game is heavily inspired by a version of XCOM, but it's the original titles from the 90s and not the kinder, gentler version that Firaxis has produced. We'll break down the gameplay and the nature of the challenge Xenonauts offers so you can judge whether it will appeal to you or not. In addition to analyzing the game on its own terms, we'll also contrast it against XCOM 2 and Enemy Unknown, since the two do have a shared heritage and there is a lot of the same DNA, even if the end results are very different. And one last thing before we start, if you decide to buy Xenonauts 2, I've managed to get a discount code that you can redeem, and I'll give you the full details at the end of the video. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. If there's one area where Xenonauts 2 and Firaxis XCOM kind of line up as having a similar feel, it's here at the base. And beyond the Firaxis games, I would just say that this is true for a lot of modern games. So I'm only going to spend a couple of minutes here. It's not really my intent to show every single facet of this game. I just want to kind of give you a sense of how it differs, what makes it more unique. So this world screen is exactly what you'd expect it to be. You're just passing time and waiting for the next event to pop up primarily. This screen I thought was a little more interesting. So this is where you actually decide which facilities you're going to build next. You can add hangars so you can have more airplanes, more room to house your staff, laboratory, workshop, training center, on and on. But here's the part I find interesting. You have this as kind of a helpful planning tool. So you can see here, I can hold up to 38 people. I only have 25. So I'm doing really good on living capacity. But on the flip side here, I definitely could stand to have more training capacity. I already built one training center, but I'm only getting full efficiency, if I had 12 or fewer. I like that this kind of helps give you a little bit more information about where you need to focus. Now, it's not perfect because there are things in here. The missile battery, I think, is a good example. It's not going to tell you you need to build a missile battery. If you want to do that to protect your base, then you do it. So you do need to pay attention to what your options are and, build what you think you need to. But this is just kind of a helpful heads up. Another thing I want to cover briefly is managing your soldiers. This will show you your roster at the time. Now, there's not really classes in this game. You can certainly decide to use people for specific roles depending on their stats, but you can switch that at any time. And even these loadouts, they have these generic loadouts. So if I say, hey, I want to equip this guy like a grenadier, that's fine, but I don't have to use this loadout as they give it to me. I can say, hey, you know what? I really want him to wear the heavy armor. But now having done that, I've put him over the weight limit. And so you can say, well then, maybe I'll get rid of his sidearm. And now I'm under the weight limit. So I lost some flexibility about how I'm going to use them on the mission, but I picked up time units and stuff by getting under the carry weight. These are all choices you can make for your squad. But this is one of the things I like is that they do make managing this relatively easy. I will say this is a game where you kind of have to want to do some micromanagement. It does not benefit you to just pick one of these packages and go with it. You need to put real care into it. Another thing that I think is a nice touch is that when you're recruiting new soldiers, you can also see their stats before you recruit them. You can make that conscious choice. Let's say you're looking for someone to be kind of a tank and you're going to give this guy the shield and all that. So, okay, well, he has a bunch of health. So maybe you want him. Whatever role you have in mind, you can see who has the stats to potentially play that part. So I do like that, and I like the fact that these guys have different stats because it does kind of force you to make trade-offs. You have to make choices. And to me, at its heart, That's really what a strategy game is all about. So I'm a big fan of the whole loadout system and the way these stats are randomized. You don't just get to have a Superman who's equally good at everything. You need to put real thought into how to use these different soldiers. Now, as I mentioned, aside from those few key things, I do feel like the base building is pretty in line with what you see in a lot of games. So I'm not going to spend any more time here. Let's go ahead and get to the real meat of this game, at least from my perspective, and that's life on the combat map. Well, life and death on the combat map. When it comes to the combat map, it's hard to even wrap my mind around the fact that both Xenonauts and Firaxis XCOM originated with the same 1990s XCOM DNA. And I can only think of one pair of twins that are more dissimilar.
We're twins.
That's right.
Visually, the pixel art is a far cry from the detailed character models that Firaxis gave us, and the color palette feels much more reminiscent of a military setting than the splashy XCOM colors, but you can see the visuals for yourself, so let's focus on the mechanics of combat. And the differences start right out of the gate. So you can see in this frame that we are not even out of our dropship yet, and we can see there are at least 2 enemies in sight. Now, this would never happen to you in most modern games, but it is happening here. But it's way worse than that because the entire structure of combat is different. It's built around what they call time units. You might think of them as action points in a lot of other games, but Overwatch and returning fire are really key elements here. So basically the idea is this. Any unused time units from your last turn, you have those available for Overwatch and return fire. Overwatch isn't something you activate, it's just your state of being in effect. As long as you have enough time units to support firing, you can fire on the enemy's turn. Just as you can do it, the enemy can do it. What does that mean in practical terms? As soon as we step forward, one or both of these guys could start shooting us. So every step you take is nerve-wracking because in addition to the enemies that we can see, frankly, it's a relief to see them in a way, you can also be shot by enemies you haven't seen yet. You step into a doorway, boom. It can happen to you anywhere, anytime. Does that mean there's no way to avoid getting shot? Because by the way, getting shot one time can easily mean the death of your soldier. There are ways to mitigate this. For example, you can equip one of your soldiers, or as many as you want, with a shield. This doesn't guarantee you won't get hit, but shields will block many incoming shots. Just be aware, if they take too much damage, the shield will be destroyed and you'll simply have a guy standing there with nothing but a pistol to his name. It's not a particularly effective trooper at that point. Another thing to remember is that as you move forward, as you prove that it's safe to move through one area, of course, other soldiers can follow in those footsteps. And you won't see enemies ranging on wide patrols as a general rule. So if you clear an area, it's generally clear for good. You do have tools and techniques that you can develop so that you aren't just constantly a sitting duck from all angles. The thing that I most want to drive home about this combat system is how constant the sense of danger is. This is not a game where you trigger a pod of aliens and have a turn to try to take them down. They see you and they may shoot and kill a soldier on the spot. And each enemy acts and reacts on its own terms. Triggering one doesn't trigger any others, and that actually helps offset the challenge somewhat. I say all of this primarily to make clear that it's critical to learn how to approach the process of clearing a map and have the discipline to follow that process consistently, or you'll be losing soldiers faster than you can replace them. The need for discipline also extends to where you position your squad. cover in this game, it really includes anything between a weapon and its target, and that includes your own soldiers. So if you have one guy firing at an alien, literally anything could end up absorbing the damage if it's in between the two of them. It could be a trash can or your sniper's head. The game doesn't care. You need to pay attention to your sight lines to avoid unnecessary friendly fire wounds and even deaths. Of course, none of this is meant to imply that the game is inherently too hard. In fact, I'm not even positive that it's harder than Firaxis XCOM overall. It's certainly harder for me right now because I'm so thoroughly indoctrinated in one paradigm and I've jumped into the deep end of the pool of a completely different one. But I have slowly adopted new techniques, learned how to avoid some of the pitfalls, and have gradually made progress. I'm not a good Xenonauts 2 player, but I'm better than I was. The question you'll need to decide is whether this type of experience on the combat map makes you want to dig into it and figure out how to get good at this, or does it make you want to just walk on by? And that sounds like my cue to move on to my final thoughts on the game, as well as share those instructions on how to get a discount that I mentioned earlier. At least for those that I haven't managed to scare off just yet. When I first played Xenonauts 2, it felt like it was crazy hard with a lot of deaths that felt kind of cheap. But one often gets that same feeling playing almost any challenging game in the early stages. And it didn't take me long before I started seeing opportunities to improve in small ways. As those improvements stacked up, it became increasingly clear that my initial actions and mistakes had a lot to do with those deaths, and maybe they weren't quite as cheap as they first seemed. This is not a game for the faint of heart or those who aren't ready to put real effort into the process of learning to play well. If you like that type of challenge and you're okay with the kind of stress that comes when you're always one moment away from potentially losing a soldier, then this could be a great game for you. I will say though, that even a genuinely good player is probably going to lose soldiers from time to time without making anything you might consider to be a true mistake. There are just going to be times when you have to take a calculated risk, and some of those won't pan out. The plus side of that is the game will not get boring and it will keep you engaged in a way that very few turn-based games can. The downside is that it can obviously be frustrating to lose soldiers if you don't think you did anything wrong, and you may simply not want to put yourself into that kind of pressure cooker. And that's fair enough. I'm not here to convince you to buy the game, just to clue you in to what it's like so you can make an informed choice. And speaking of that choice, if you do like what you see, then I've put a link in the description so you can buy a Steam code through Games Planet. Follow the link and enter the code Xenonauts to get 10% off. Full disclosure, I do get a small commission if you use the link, but if you found this video helpful, then hopefully you don't mind supporting the channel in that way, while also getting 10% off for yourself. And if the game isn't for you, or you prefer to buy elsewhere, then fair enough. By the way, the game is going to be released on July 18th for PC, but no console availability, so it's not out as I record this, but it's coming soon.
And hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!